Hey there, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's a big one, the newest project from Jason Isbell, Foxes in the Snow. I've talked before about the blurry line that confessional singer-songwriters can walk, where a fundamental part of their artistic appeal is that they're sharing something with the audience that's raw and real, rooted in something they actually live. And that's true across any number of genres, from country to rap to pop to emo to R&B to so much more. But what often does not get discussed is the other side of that dynamic, and not just writing those songs, but the repeated performance thereof. Not only is there a performative element, which creates the question of how real said emotions become, but sometimes the naked reality that it can be all just way too much to process. It prevents those artists from healing or moving on. There are so many acts, especially in and around various subgenres of emo, that just don't include certain songs in their live sets anymore because they're too raw, they're too uncomfortable. Or on the other side, they don't represent where they are in their lives nowadays, and you don't want to reopen old wounds, especially if you've done so much work to heal for yourself. But expanding on that conversation, what happens if you're a detail-oriented singer-songwriter who is going through a divorce and suddenly previous songs of love and relationship turmoil now have a particular twinge that you can't quite ignore, especially in a world where some parasocial fans or music writers take it to extremes and then think they can chart the path of your marriage's collapse? Well, into this space comes Jason Isbell, one of the best singer-songwriters of the past 15 or so years, at least, known for a lot of confessional, detail-rich songwriting, much of which in recent years has circled some real people in his life and his marriage to the fellow singer-songwriter Amanda Shires. And part of the power from both of their recorded output has come from their relationship, their interplay, and a lot of the complicated struggles, in which neither are perfect nor blameless. I mean, it's a mistake to equivocate a pedestal in artistry for them as people. One of the reasons I like both of their work is that messy, complicated humanity will shine through, although it does make their 2022 documentary, Running With My Eyes Closed, a pretty tough watch, kind of hard to recommend. Now, I wish I could say I was surprised that they got divorced. On some level, I was rooting for them, but I knew of Isbell's volatility from his first marriage, and I could imagine many bridges remained aflame apart from what was being said on record. At the same time, while I knew there was some conjecture that could be drawn around emotions that might have sparked the divorce, there is a certain care required in reviewing albums like this, because there's this temptation to think that you know everything that happened behind the scenes. And I'm sorry, you will never have that full picture, especially when there are kids involved, and it doesn't appear to be all that amicable to see what's going on in the press. I mean, Isbell even said it himself, that there might be snapshots and emotionality that's pulled from his real experiences, but trying to stitch it all together like a true crime podcast and hunting for Easter eggs, that'll look past the actual art, not that it hasn't stopped some from trying. Oh god. So hence we got Foxes in the Snow, no 400 unit credit this time. Jason Isbell stripped it all down to just acoustic guitar, co-produced by Nashville veteran Gina Johnson, who has got a ridiculous string of top quality credits, including the last 3 Jason Isbell albums where she contributed. I normally have some reservations about pure acoustic projects. They can run together pretty fast without that much in the way of differentiation, but Jason Isbell is the sort of writer who can transcend that, so what path is he leading us on this time? Honestly, I'm not sure he knows fully himself, which is one of the reasons that discussing Foxes in the Snow is a little bit more difficult than you might think. If you're looking for a more straightforward breakup narrative or one of healing and reconciliation, this is not that album. It's a lot more diffuse and scattered, snapshots of emotionality that don't coalesce because Isbell himself is not coalesced emotionally. The reality of breakups like this is they can leave you feeling adrift, especially when your art and your life has been intermingled with that relationship, where I get less confusion and more haggard weariness. Jason Isbell's written a lot of songs across the past decade where he has struggled to find a place, questions if he's the last of his kind, but there's a real difference between contemplating the moment and actually living it, which means that Isbell's characteristic wide, raw framing isn't about to let him get away unscathed. He's a great writer, but with years of context, it's hard to ignore the choice to throw all all the mess up on display. And all this is done on an acoustic album with limited production where it is just him, his guitar, and the audience. It's a goddamn miracle the project doesn't feel claustrophobic, but I was worried about some of the stark limitations of this format, and they absolutely came to pass. Which is why a part of me kind of struggles to put this among Jason Isbell's best, even if there are some absolute transcendent songs here, and this is ultimately going to get a recommendation. I think it's excellent, but again, he's made transcendent classic albums. But let's get the biggest issue out of the way first. If all you've got is your acoustic guitar, even if you're an incredibly skilled guitarist like he is, you run the serious risk of the project running together because the only differentiation comes in compositional structure, slight volume dynamics, and the methods of playing said guitar, especially as Isbell's not really doing anything that's all that interesting with the production beyond some slight touches of reverb, and maybe keeping the guitar tone brittle but somewhat warm. That's not saying there isn't missteps there either. He comes in rather sharply opening up Bury Me, something you'd think they may have caught in the mixing, even if Isbell wanted to sound this raw in order to set the tone of the album, but the larger risk was always gonna be the more conventional melodies not feeling all that special that will need the writing to put them on a different tier. And yet I'll be damned if the vast majority of the guitar work doesn't get there on his own. I love the subtle cycling that weaves through Ride to Roberts with a really nice searching bridge, a similar sort of unresolved shuffle that comes through on Crimson and Clay, where despite a lot of the major chords, it never feels like an answer is properly found. Gravelweed balances out its brittle, loud, soft dynamics perfectly between the verses, and a louder hook that paradoxically feels more fragile. It's kind of interesting to the counterbalance that on the more robust hook of True Believer, and then you have the fluttery intro of Open and Close that somehow blends and transitions into the more deliberate and plaintive structure of the song, and I'm shocked by how well it works. Hell, as much as Don't Be Tough is probably the most conventionally sounding country composition on the album, it actually kind of reminds me a lot of Laurie McKenna's excellent Humble and Kind, covered by Tim McGraw. That's damn near a decade old at this point. There's a warm, homespun charm to it that comes in precisely at the right time, and I think it works. Similar to the rootsier strumming that anchors Good While It Lasted. A little bit less so for Wind Behind the Rain, which ends the album on an optimistic note, but also feels a shade disconnected from the project as a whole. We'll get to why later on. On the flip side, the title track has this sour, minor key bluesy edge that never fully clicked. Even if the lead melody on the solo is really distinctive, it will stick in your head. Probably the song on the album that I think could have used a little bit more of a developed arrangement with electric guitar or a meatier bass, maybe even a touch of organ to put it over the top there. But again, those are some of the fine details, and if you find the overall acoustic guitar tone of this project one-dimensional, I would understand that. But again, it is very purposeful in order to center all the writing and themes. Let's get into that at length. And the first reality here is that Jason Isbell's floor as a songwriter is so goddamn high that in terms of structuring turns of phrase and excellent poetry, it immediately feels compelling, but if you're left thinking the detail on display is very deliberately sliced, where it might seem fragmented until you understand what he's looking to do, you wouldn't be that far afield. If anything, it feels like the double-edged sword of being that confessional singer-songwriter who is also clearly still processing the tumultuous events of his life in real time. If you become too vague, and even the high standard of writing starts feeling a little bit anonymous, especially with this instrumental palette. But become too specific, and assuming the lawyers don't get involved, it can feel uncomfortably revealing. The trauma dump from someone proving that they probably do not deserve a pedestal, at least at this moment, and in both cases, any sort of cryptic framing is going to have all the parasocial fact finders out in droves. Already I've seen both sides of this, unfortunately. The misogyny tourists who want to make Amanda Shires the next Amanda Heard, and all of whom can go fuck themselves soundly, but also some of the folks who have some trepidation in how this sort of art that inevitably mentions the mother of his children becomes very public and is performed on tour, especially when it's obvious that Jason Isbell hasn't fully dealt with all of this. That's gonna raise some questions, but even then, it's not that surprising. It's an arc that I've already observed between albums with Jason Isbell, is that when he thinks he's got an issue settled away, it often comes roaring back in earnest. I mean, that was true between Something More Than Free and the Nashville Sound. It's true between The Weather Vanes, and this. But I would also say it goes deeper this time, and where I think this project cuts the deepest becomes most obvious on Gravelweed, immediately the album highlight and probably one of the best songs he's ever written, about the failure of his writing, his own narratives. I know this sort of meta text is a big fixation of mine. If you want perhaps the best possible example of it, check out the heartbreaking Skeleton Tree by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, or hell, just look at my video essay on Push the Skyway, also by Nick Cave. But when an artist discovers the failure of his or her own art or narrative to save something or contextualize a moment, or recognizing that the meaning has inevitably changed in a bigger world and you can't just write your way out, but you gotta try because it's the closest thing you have working through all of it, yeah, it's powerful. So when I hear, and now that I live to see my melodies betray me, I'm sorry the love songs all mean different things today, that's devastating with context. Flagship becomes different, Strawberry Woman is different, Cover Me Up and If We Were Vampires are way different, at least for him. And if he sounds dazed and exhausted processing all of that, I get it. It also makes sense why the album has to build up to Gravelweed. Bury Me establishes the adrift mood, but I think it's the weakest song on the album. Ride to Roberts captures some of that diffuse pondering, although it might set the mood as being a little bit too optimistic in the blur of relationships both past and present. And while Eileen feels a little more like a character portrait of what it is like to be in a crumbling relationship that you thought could last forever, especially with certain letters that are left for the other partner, which I distinctly remember was reminiscent of what Shires described in certain interviews around 2022 as how she and Isbell would communicate some relationship grievances. Gravelweed is just vulnerable and raw, where he cannot force the traditional machismo deflections, especially when he's old and mature enough to know that it was likely both of their faults. And age is a major factor as well on this project. Multiple times here, Isbell's thinking about taking a nap, letting a quick moment of oblivion pass the time away. But it's also relevant in contextualizing maturity and the deep temptation to throw that maturity out the window for catharsis. It's why I like Don't Be Tough a lot in the album's context. It's very good advice on how to love and recover, take care of yourself, but also very clearly directed at himself as advice that he needs to take more often. It's also why I don't mind the title track being uglier, with that same echo of previous relationships, fights he can't escape, his own flaws. And it's also very true on the New York-centered Open and Close, which is easily the most direct in focusing on his new girlfriend, the painter and heiress, Anna Wyant. Really, for me, if you felt old in a bar, feeling too good for being in the bar, but also trying to recapture a vibe that you barely understood at the time, trying to meet new people, which Jason Isbell calls back to later on Good While It Lasted, yeah, that one hits. It also means that Crimson and Clay simultaneously fits on the album, but is also a little bit out of place. He's trying to make a love song for his hometown in Alabama, but by the third verse, he just cannot do it once again. He's changed too much to accept all the religious fundamentalism and conservatism and intolerance in that space. He wants to make a song for the kids there who are also trying to get out, but he keeps coming back. It fits with how adrift he feels, but it also doesn't really mesh with the relationship angst of the album. It's more fitting the mood rather than any sort of narrative, but the album doesn't have much of a narrative. That makes sense too. And it also ends on a really strong note. First we have Good While It Lasted, hopelessly romantic, and he's stoicism barely holding it together, and it's a cycle of beautiful memories that he just can't shake, wistful and thinking it was good while it lasted. It's interesting to contemplate on this album on what feels like it lasts forever and can't escape, which, compared to what never seems to stick, even if he thought it was his best shot for it. And that takes us to True Believer, which many have also highlighted as focusing on Amanda Shires. Yeah, I love this song, but mostly because I don't think it leaves either of them looking all that good, and the song is better for it. Isbell is a die-hard optimist here. As much as there was a backslide, he is never giving up hope. He's the optimistic who never stops believing in love. But my God, that is not the best fit for everyone, or even most people in such times. It can feel self-possessed to the point of arrogance. It's stubborn as all hell, frequently holier than thou, when even if you're right, the attitude's gonna piss people off, especially in a world that tends to reward you if you can deliver on it, and that can drive real friction in relationship between artists that are on the same path. I don't know, can you tell it strikes a little bit too close to home for me? So, I might find it stirring to watch Jason Isbell finally burn that last letter and move on, but always believed that what was there and recognized that it was real no matter what the girlfriends might say. But if you're thinking by the end that it's kind of sanctimonious and hasn't really engaged with other deeper flaws in the relationship, especially for the woman for which Isbell wrote Death Wish in Middle of the Morning, and then she wrote Fault Lines about you, you wouldn't be wrong. And then we got the closing track, Wind Behind the Rain, which is a song that Jason Isbell actually wrote for his little brother and his wife when they got married as a first dance song. It's simple, it's beautifully romantic, effortlessly poetic, of course it is, where if you don't know the context, I can imagine that this sort of upbeat ending is going to hit even worse, and even then it feels a little disconnected. But for the first time, he's stepping outside himself to contemplate that unrequited love, even if it is still in the first person, because he is still a true believer. And even if he feels adrift, I don't know, it's something close to hope. Maybe he can cling to that. You know what struck me in resembling this review? It's a line from God's Favorite Customer by Father John Misty. Jason Isbell's here as well, and he seemed a little worried about you. I mean, given the bender that underscores that album from 2018, it makes a lot of sense. Jason Isbell's even acknowledged that, especially if you believe all the rumors about what caused said bender in the hotel in the first place. Look up a certain song on Norman fucking Rockwell if you want the presumed other side of that. But I gotta wonder if Josh Tillman actually called Jason Isbell after hearing this album, if he heard it. Because while Foxes in the Snow paradoxically ends on a more upbeat note despite the relationship failing, it has a lot of that same adrift, ragged exhaustion, where the singer-songwriter might be on the verge of imploding but is trying to write his way out, hold it all together. Like with God's Favorite Customer, it is absolutely not a jump-on point for the artist, and where the more context you have, the more you'll probably appreciate the art, but glance askance at the artist and man behind it. Especially given that it's also clearly not his best either. It's not better than Weather Vanes, it's not better than Something More Than Free. Maybe it's better than Reunions, but I kind of overrated the album at the time in 2020. I mean, that was true of a lot of things in 2020, it happens. But given how ragged and tenuous that project often felt, has me wondering how this is gonna age. And I go back to what I said in my overlonging musing/video essay about Drake a month ago. When you're vulnerable in your art to the point where it becomes integral to your persona, it allows a certain shamelessness. And while I appreciate framing that does not let Jason Isbell off the hook, the lesson that Drake's never learned, the divisive response to this album, it feels warranted and appropriate. For now, I am going to say it's excellent. I'd say it's best for Jason Isbell fans, except a lot of you might be a lot less of a fan by the end of it, and I wouldn't blame you for it. But then again, he said it himself 5 years ago. It gets easier, but it never gets easy. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you want to see more, please be sure to like, share, drop comments, subscribe. This took a little longer than I was expecting. Part of it was IRL stuff the previous week, but yeah, I need to think my way through this. It's not an easy album. I want to hope I did the justice in the review, because again, it's a tough one to parse through, especially when you have all of that context. But hey, leave your comments down there below and try to avoid some of the parasocial speculation on both Isbell and Shires. I think a lot of it's in bad taste. There are kids involved. Let's be mature here. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if y'all want to get involved in getting projects on my schedule, or helping support the channel, or yelling at me on my Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. Also, YouTube memberships. Don't feel obligated. It's tough times out there, I understand. The option's available. Till then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.